Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tea with TPS, an informal chat with thought leaders in India and abroad. Our distinguished guest today is Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, who is here basically as a former ambassador to China. But he is much more than that. He was Under Secretary General of the United Nations, Chef de Cabinet of the Secretary General, Permanent Representative of India to the UN, Ambassador High Commissioner to Pakistan, and so many other places where he has made a big mark and is one of the most distinguished members of the Indian Civil Service. He's my batchmate and a good friend. Welcome, Vijay, to Tea with GPS.
Thank you, Srini. It has been a great pleasure to when you rang me up and told me that you want. Now, I don't consider myself sort of updated in terms of what has been happening in China as such. So, to some extent, I thought you'd have a cozy conversation. But the kind of issues that you have suggested that we should be is intimidating somewhat. But nevertheless, I suppose we'll try to address them because this is something that concerns all of us, and I think it should be interesting for us to just chat on that.
There's a lot of interest in this. I get all kinds of questions, and so that's why I thought this would be good to have this conversation. Well, we say anything that happens in China affects the world one way or the other. We have been hearing for the last 40 years only good news about China. Fast progress, catching up with the United States, almost overtaking the United States, and so on. And that worried all of us. All the time we were worried about that. Not because we are envious of the Chinese people, but because the growth of China had a certain element of threat to the rest of the world because of their expansionism, their desire to dominate Asia, and then the world. All these were concerning to all of us. And people used to say that China cannot be stopped unless two things happen. One, a liberal economic system in a tight political structure may not work. And therefore, there would be a contradiction. That was one situation people used to say might bring down China. The second is infinite deterioration of the environment. Because the industrialization, they have not taken much care to take care of the environment. I have been in China in June when you could not see, the road, that much of pollution was there and so on. So they thought that would be another way China could suffer and their progress would be delayed. So now it looks both these things have come into play at a time, and therefore China seems to be readjusting itself to both the situations. So we have these very many trends. And my first question to you is how far back can you trace this change? And what would be the reasons? The reasons being suggested, one is the economic crisis, so many things, reduction, the power shortages, the stock prices falling, etc. on one hand. And secondly, there is also this anxiety whether there is a political change inside and Xi Jinping is struggling to survive for his third term. So these may be factors, but what do you think is the force behind these major changes that is being brought about?
Well, thank you. Let me attempt it by saying that, we tend to think very strongly. We tend to take very short-term approach to some of the challenges as well as the ways in which they've been addressing. I think that the kinds of problems that China has been facing are not new. And it is, in a sense, it has been envisaged and it has been anticipated by their leaders one way or the other. And particularly since after the end of the Mao phase, as it were. Obviously, before that, the growth of China in the kind of dramatic growth we saw only after Deng Xiaoping's sort of changing the system as a whole. And there too, I think immediately after Deng Xiaoping, in a sense, made the first great opening up as a reform and opening up. And in a sense, he brought an entirely new dimension, which is non-ideological, to build China, make China rich, etc. And that set in stage the whole kind of unbridled kind of expansion, as it were. And there was a time, as you also said, that when of the 10 most polluted cities in the world, China had 6 or 7 of them. And in fact, that has changed partly because the approach to development, they have gone through a process of continuous reaching and continuous rethinking. And that resilience, and this is what they call resilient authoritarianism, as it were, they're constantly changing and looking at the problems and challenges, both ideologically as well as in a broader sociological sense of how it affects the people. I think the stage which Deng Xiaoping talked about initially was to get, they had to get rich first. They had to first, I think what is now being talked about is first,
some people become richer in the process.
Stand up, second, get rich. And then it is, in fact, then, grow strong, as it were. These are and now then, then actually sock it to them in the world, as it were. That was perhaps the kind of the latest situation. But each time they've done it very carefully and with a kind of there has been a lot of thinking in terms of what the impact has been. So just as in terms of the immediately after the Deng Xiaoping kind of changes, there was a very, very rapid movement, in a sense, to to try and get from, learn from, as well as to ape the West in many ways. And of course, the fascination both for between the competition between the regions, between the localities, the stress on township and village enterprises became very, very, it went helter skelter. And then they had to put a very strong brake on them. And then, then they said that they would sort of concentrate on industrialization, building, developing capitalists, etc. Now that resulted in a great deal of, let's say, crony capitalism, princelings coming over, and then corruption. And that corruption had to be addressed as a second. And then you found that, for example, during Jiang Zemin's, his idea of what they call the 3 represents gave ideological sanction to the advanced production forces, what they call an advanced culture, and they talked about the fundamental interests of the majority of the people. But what was happening is that there was a runaway development of one region, that is the eastern part of China. And there were some elements, many of them connected with the previous political aristocracy, that is the princelings, etc., who were making money. And that actually, there had to be naturally a movement against that. And that resulted in a whole new set of changes, which resulted in controlling that. Then subsequently, of course, you had the joining up with the West resulted in seeing some of the problems of capitalism being, in a sense, replicated in China, and through the state capitalists. Of course, the main problem at that time was actually the balance. This was in the 80s and 90s, the balance between the central planning and local planning. I think they have always realized that much of the dynamism in China comes from the locality. And it is, in fact, I recall Chu Rongqi in the 90s, etc., had actually decided to put a strong brake and apply the centralization measures, and called on the localities to, in a sense, the funding that they used to get was actually tightened. And this actually resulted in the township and villages enterprises actually falling down. And subsequently,
during this period of change after the Deng Xiaoping,
yes,
was there a forceful communist element underground or opposing the changes? And are they now coming back to dominate? Is that how you see it?
To an extent, they've always been. There has always been the up and down. There has been of course, it was not you found people harking back to the Mao questions of economism and things like that, but in a new context. And that is, in a sense, all the Lu Tingyi and people like that. There were lots of people who, there was another Tang, in fact, I forget his, who was a kind of very strong leftist element, who was a strong, who saw this moving in this moving movement towards capitalism, saying there's no great difference between what is happening in the West and what are we aping the West. There was, for example, the one of the strongest. I used to know him quite well. A person, a philosopher, and a party. He was the deputy editor of the People's Daily, who talked about the alienation that you suffer from socialism as well as capitalism. Alienation, he said, happens not only in capitalism but also in socialism. And he talked about the need to actually move towards greater questioning of the authorities, etc. Of course, this came in the 89s and things like that. And he actually became he was actually dismissed from, and he actually, Wang Qishan is one of the another Wang, as you said, from in the 80s, and he died in 90s. Yeah, sorry, in the 2002 he died. In fact, when I was ambassador, I used to often go to him. He used to be in the People's Daily compound, and used to talk about how there has to be a mix between, on the one hand, the party authority, which was something which Deng Xiaoping was absolutely insistent upon, and all the leaders, if you notice, right from the beginning, right from Deng Xiaoping's time, whatever the economic policy may be, the question of the control of the party was the most important, and this actually resulted in centralization. Among the leaders, one of the few leaders who realized that centralization can be difficult to actually sustain the kind of growth was Zhu Rongji, Prime Minister under Jiang Zemin. And he actually, in 1994, without writing, he gave an assurance to the localities, to the local governments, that they would be allowed to incentivize their officials to be able to, in a sense, raise funding locally through property. Through the at that time, property was not privately owned, but they owned the government owned the properties, and they could use property to actually raise money. And that, to a very large extent, was responsible for the continued kind of, in a sense, resilience of economic growth, even after the township village enterprises went down and the big capitalists, private capitalists, started coming. And that the impact of the private capitalists, actually, many of whom were connected with the families of the political leaders. And this famous Desmond Shum book, what is called Red Roulette or something, which talks about, huge people like, the wife of the prime minister of the country being one of the major sort of owners of one of the richest persons inside the country. Now, these things had actually resulted in a very strong move away from the giving encouragement to the private capitalists to be able to at least to control them. This is not to suggest that any of the recent changes are going to completely change the role of private capital. Private capital in Chinese capital will still remain considerably. There has to be both. So, of course, the main thing would be emphasis on state-owned enterprises, which will form the vanguard of future development. That would not
40
be.
years, after 40 years, are they rediscovering the merits of communism? Can we interpret it like that?
No, I think it's still not the merits of they're still real. They've always been moving between a strong state capitalism and a private sector, and I think they need the best balance. I don't think they're moving.
Now they are doing it, causing damage to themselves. Billions of dollars being lost in foreign investment by destroying, technology companies, destroying property companies, the tuition, companies. And these are all dominating. And by reducing their growth, and reducing their size and taking over state control, they are losing billions of dollars.
All these billions of dollars they're losing are putative billions of dollars that in a sense is market capitalization, but at the same time they recognize that if they allow that in the hands of these private the impact in terms of the larger social harmony, and that's where intense Hu Jintao's moved away from giving representation to building a very strong economy to harmony, to better, to that just the predecessor of Xi Jinping, as it were, talked about social harmony, balanced development, and balances between the regions. All these are things which increasingly are coming home to roost and affecting them, and is affecting the political unity of the country and political kind of stability in the country, and giving rise to a kind of challenges to the party and to the leadership, which I think is what has resulted in this kind of sudden movement. To bring back, as it were, to corral all these various things together.
But Xi Jinping had not shown any indication that he would go back to what he now calls people's prosperity, because he was going very well on the basis of Deng Xiaoping's policies and the BRI and all that. He was out to conquer the world on the basis of what Deng Xiaoping had done, and at that nobody guessed that there would be this kind of pushback on the kind of capitalism which was growing. Was there any indication?
Well, yes and no, because both the people who, when at the end of the Hu Jintao, towards the end of the Hu Jintao era, both when Bo Xilai, one of his major sort of let's say his major rivals, who was also a princeling, who was the son of a leader of the Communist Party of China, Po Yipo, and Xi Jinping, both of them actually went back to Mao, and they were talking about the need to look at and this was more partly, of course, it was the political, the mass line, talking more about going back to the masses. They were using the masses, as it were, more as a political mobilization, but they did not do much at that time to stop because they were profiting from it also. They stopped the princelings and the private capitalists, but they did talk about the need for a broader, the need to have a social conscience. They did talk about it, and to an extent, in a sense, I think some of the people who were the intellectuals, and I think the role of the intellectuals is a very important. I think has been, they have from time to time, people like Wang Huning and others have been warning the system to move towards actually looking at some of the larger social and cultural consequences of these policies. And I think this.
What I'm driving at is, because he is going to get his third term, which is unprecedented.
Exactly.
He may have had these challenges, and he felt that to secure his position, he needed to make concessions to the.
Exactly. Now, having established himself well in the political kind of, in terms of political power, I think he is now looking at the larger place in history, as it were, and at the larger role, which to avoid, as it were, the kind. The party has celebrated its 100th anniversary. They are looking for the state to become a moderately developed country by 49. At the same time, they realize that this cannot happen without looking at the larger impact of a system which develops, which looks at China's international obligations in terms of the climate change kind of things. Also, you can't have a situation where the economic development comes at such a great cost to the ecosystems, etc. That is one thing that they have.
So in other words, spectacular success was not enough to sustain itself.
Absolutely, I agree. Okay. That's exactly. It's not just success, but success itself, in terms of the constantly adjusting policy, is fine. But more than adjusting policy, it had to look at all the parameters in terms of what can be seen as as a kind of an economy which is responsive and responsible for sustainability in the larger future. And that, I think, is was
Did the pandemic play a role in all this readjustment in the world happening all around the world and China being at the center of it? You mean COVID-19? Did it have an impact on these policies, or it is unrelated?
COVID-19, again, over the years, as you know, COVID itself, they had experiences of the COVID in the SARS in previous years, and they had developed very strong protocols over there. But there again, it is really, I think it is partly the absence of the spontaneous development of pressures and let's say the dynamism of the localities. The fact is nobody listens to the center very often. It's all very well to talk about various rules, etc. But at the local level, as in India, there's a large amount of violation, disregard for rules, etc., which result.
Even in China, we take it for granted in India.
Yes. I think you'd be surprised. It's amazing that there has been a major amount of that kind of of people going across and just in a sense moving away. Jugaad is as much there, but of course it's in a different sense, and that I think had caused the kind of problems which they witnessed in a huge magnitude in the pandemic that developed in Wuhan. And I think that was a major reminder, a major kind of a reality check for them. And at the same time, looking at I think as the economy developed and the private entrepreneurs were developing, there was, I think, a major sense that the centralized control of the party may actually be affected. And it is really this particular sense which brought brought Xi Jinping to actually move to a very strong reassertion of centralization, of order, of the rule of the sort of the whip of the party in terms of being able to move. And here too, I think there's a good book by Tony Sach on the Chinese Communist Party from to rebel to reform or something like that, where he talks about the fact that even today the localities in the various local customs and the dominance of the local even the various families, etc., is still so powerful that they assert a lot of the political power and in a sense the economic the drive has to come from there. And I think it is if there is a problem, I feel in China today, it will be from excessive centralization, and that I think will probably eventually, I think, as they go along, they probably loosen the sort of the strings. In some ways, I think what Xi Jinping is following is a reassertion of what they call the Chanyun approach, as it were, by which reforms should actually expand the overall cake. Yes, at the same time, they should operate within particular parameters. They should, and that parameters would be dictated by the party.
But during the pandemic, till very recently, China maintained a very aggressive posture.
Yes.
Everybody, to us, to South China Sea, to Taiwan, to Hong Kong. Yes. At that time, there was no indication that some such thing was coming. It looked as though they were going on the same, trajectory, and China is trying to take the place of the United States as though there was a vacuum. All the tendencies were very, very clear, even for a layman like me. But when is it that this shift took place, that this is not enough? We need to take care of the people's prosperity. And is that a subsequent thing, or that was already there during the pandemic?
Well, I think that these ideas, which were actually in a sense were being generated quite earlier, I don't think that these were suddenly came, but the pandemic actually, and in a sense, exaggerated or accentuated the problems, and also at the same time, for power reasons, for political reasons, the fact that Xi Jinping was initially under some pressure with regard to the management of the pandemic. And in fact, there was initially, in the earlier stages, there was almost a feeling that that this will have an impact in terms of the higher leadership. But that did not happen, mainly because I think with a very astute management of what they call the discourse, the narrative, as it were, the overall public narrative was very well handled by the leadership. They took charge rather than be seen as following, and they were, in fact, they were able very quickly to take charge and be seen as actually on the top in terms of consideration. Earlier, they were seen, in fact, the way in which the authorities were in denial, in denial of even the outbreak of the pandemic.
Wasn't it a defensive mechanism? So the
Yes.
whole world was accusing them of having created the virus, at least not having publicized it initially. So there was a certain amount of guilt feeling they had. And therefore, Trump saying that this is a Wuhan virus and all that. And therefore, they wanted to be particularly aggressive and show to the world that we can overcome this. And
Yes.
in fact, we can overcome it for the rest of the world.
Yes, of course, it was. I think there was a certain sense of a defensiveness in the way they approached it. But at the same time, you must realize that this was also the time when they were realizing that they were on the back foot with regard to the decoupling. Also, there was a major amount of dependence on the world economy, and in terms of innovation, particularly the dependence on the technology from the West. And this, for example, I didn't realize that one of the biggest imports of China, more than even oil, is chips.
Yes.
Yeah, it's much more than even oil. And that the fact is, yes, and of course it does produce itself a large amount of chips itself, but some of the major cutting edge kind of things they can't get, and they need it even from Taiwan. They have to take it, and therefore that was one of the kind of problems that they have been facing. And I think to an extent there was a sense that they will face economic pressures as a result of the supply chains being disturbed, and people, as a result of the political differences and the difficulties with the West, with the US as well as locally, they will face major pressures, and that to an extent decided they had to look at bringing about a major relook at how to manage the economy. And I think that
there the strange thing is that he first attacked the high-tech companies, Alibaba and Didi and all that. So if he was worried about technological development, they should have been further enhancing the ability of the tech companies rather than hitting them.
It's not the tech companies. For example,
he realized that tech companies could not be doing as well as it was doing in the past.
Yeah, the question, I think the Alibaba and others were really leveraging tech. They were not producing technology. I mean, it's people like Huawei and others who were actually leveraging technology. Who were actually building and adding to the innovation. The Alibaba and others were using technology to, in a sense, to build up wealth through services, etc., both inside the country and outside the country. They were basically rent seeking from this technology. The fact is that it's the other technology companies which were building artificial intelligence and the things like that, high tech in terms of the defense industries. These are the ones who were the technology builders, and they were the ones who had to be protected. That, to an extent, those were to be increasingly under the state, and I think that is that's an important aspect of the recentering, as it were, that they had produced, that they had introduced.
And then this tutoring, I never realized that it was such a huge business there. We seem to be going in the same direction in India, as you may have noticed.
Yes.
All these private companies taking over school education.
Yeah.
Increasing the value or expense on children's education. And it was swooped down in a big way. $11 billion is sacrificed in order to put them all down and say that the school education should go back to the school teachers. So was that a big danger?
I think this is connected again with the overall idea of common prosperity. In fact, I think this as they built on in terms of the how to realize, as it were, the China dream, which the rejuvenation of China, I think, as a result of the 100th anniversary of the party, etc. I think they realized that some of these things could not be possible unless they looked at the larger question of the common prosperity, the bigger question of the common move from growing the pie to distributing the pie. That is, I think, fairly important. And that when they saw that, they also saw that much of even the education, it was actually moving in the direction of helping the rich rather than helping the common. And I think that is happening here too, as you said.
Suffering on account of that, and even people not wanting to have more than one child.
That's right.
They say, 3 times the cost of school education elsewhere.
Yes.
So this is something which will have an impact on India, because we are also going the same direction. There are many companies, small startups, which have been attracting money from the West, huge numbers.
Yeah.
And they are dominating the so-called tuition industry in India also. So this could be a signal that this is not very good for the ordinary people, because they will not be able to afford the kind of fees, etc., being charged. While you have a school and they are maintaining it, but nobody bothers about what they study in the school. They depend on the tuition classes.
Then the quality of the education deteriorates in the institutions, and then it actually, people get more and more reliant on the private sort of tutors and things like that. And I think this is, and in the process, it adds to a lot of other things, like they said, people having to do grunge work, jig work, as they say, for 9 to 9, 6 days in the week and things like that. This 996 thing which they talked about. All these things have developed into a kind of major disturbances, turbulences within the social structure. And I think that called for a change. And I think this is where common prosperity talks of bridging the wealth gap and the balance between growth and equity.
And how does the property game play up in this? Because Evergrande, we all know. Yeah. And earlier, the idea was that you would develop as much of property as possible. In fact, even in India, some of the experts were suggesting we have so much land in the country. Why don't we produce mass housing and create a housing revolution? And that is probably what the Chinese have done. So why are they putting a brake on that? Doesn't that affect the middle class? They are all seeking apartments, seeking buildings. So putting down Evergrande and other property developers, is he not hurting the ordinary people?
This is actually what they're planning, what he was talking. I don't know whether you've heard about, they talked about what they call the olive-shaped distribution structure between a large middle class and two small things. They realized is necessary. And in order to do that, you had to have taxation had to happen. And I think there was a need to introduce a certain element of social progressive taxation, which introduced a much greater degree of benefits for the middle class and not for the for the rich alone. And
No, but
actually,
shortage of housing will be a problem for the ordinary people.
the construction sector had developed largely. There was a fair amount of this thing. It is built, but the fact is, I think here again, these were going into not into public housing and to smaller housing, but in terms of large kind of. It was more in terms of investment. Many of the houses were not even being. It was mainly done for speculative purposes, as was being done. He says what she talked about is to improve the housing supply and support systems, and the housing is required for living in and not for speculation. He mentions that very clearly. He also recommended property
Many
regulation, tax
apartments are,
regulation.
many apartments are empty. People
Absolutely, absolutely.
they live in their small homes and rent it out, and that probably was a situation that they wanted to do.
Yeah, and that is exact. And those were mainly in the cities. And they were talking about particularly the smaller cities. These were in the big cities. And that's why actually China, immediately after he said this, in fact, they introduced new regulations, changing the entire policy environment within the property system. And I think that has actually, I don't know, it has introduced a certain element of constraints. And I think they've made some very, very specific constraints. I don't know what is it. I think there's, yeah, I think I find it here. There are 3 red lines which have been adopted. I think Shams mentions it. A 70% ceiling on liabilities to assets, excluding advance proceeds from projects sold on a contract, 100% cap on net debt to equity, and a cash to short term ratio with a very strong, very balanced ratio between short term borrowing and cash. And all these are meant actually to strike down on excessive speculative uses and on investments in property, which would be used mainly to actually leverage the profits of the big of people like Evergrande. And I think these again are actually, they are striking at private capital. It's not that it's going to affect. It will be affecting in a very major way the net, let's say, stock of property that is needed in the middle and the smaller sort of cities.
Yes, but the consequence of it will be that a lot of private investment from abroad will fly off.
Yes, yes.
And people may migrate to other countries, whoever is giving them the facilities. And they don't seem to mind it.
I think this is the interesting thing. They look at it from a slightly longer perspective and not the immediate perspective. I think once these corrections are built, just the market will come back. Slowly it will come back, but it will have to be then done within the corrected perspective. And I think that is it's important. And major companies, major organizations which are actually responsible for this, they will have to move out of the game, and new players will come in. And I think this is why there is what they call some of these companies will go bankrupt. Some of them, and I think they will help them to go bankrupt.
But the state will still have enough money to handle this. That is their confidence.
I think that is where I think there is an extraordinary confidence which the authorities have, the party has in their banking system, in the public banking system. Now,
that is always a control. Banking system is always.
Yes, that's true, and that is built on the myth of the banking system itself, and I think they have much more control there. Here, my only question is: this will also affect the smaller, at the local level. This is going to affect the dynamism which I talked about earlier, in terms of how the local developments will have less. Increasingly, they will have less funds which they can put onto development, they'll have to depend much more on centralization. And central control is going to be increased. And my own sense is in the longer term, that is going to be the bane of the resilient authoritarianism that Xi is now bringing up increasingly. There is at each
Moving on to the cultural changes.
Yes.
This film star disappearing, somebody who has 85 million followers, and suddenly he disappears, and there is a clampdown on all these sissy men and all kinds of words they are using. And has it to do with people's prosperity, or is it a different game altogether? It is the hatred of the American system. This gentleman Wang Huning said that you must distance ourselves from the decadent American culture. How did this get mixed up with this?
No, there are two things. I don't think Wang Huning was. In fact, I think Wang Huning was an extraordinarily sort of impressive in a sense in terms of he talks about
He seems to be the Raja Guru, they say.
In some ways, he's talked about. He's been variously described as the Mikhail Suslov. In fact, there's been a lot of these things. Ideologue in the sense almost like the ideologues, the philosophers of the French Revolution and things like that. But in many ways, I think he's truly a scholar in many ways. And his writings on even America against America, he talks about the good as well as the bad in America. I think he talks basically of the false image of the US in Chinese intellectuals. He says, USA was neither as exploitative and an exploitative tyranny that the older Marxists talked about, nor are they the utopia of freedom envisioned by the young liberals today. He says it's a complicated, United States is a complicated society. On the one side, there's wealth. On the other side, there's poverty. On the one side, there's high tech. On the other side, there's primitive beliefs. On the one side, there is hierarchy. On the other side, there is equality. All these are juxtaposed. And that's a fair reading of the United States. But his main problem is this is not for us.
That's
the point. And the Chinese should not...
We should not be doing what the Americans are doing.
We shouldn't be blindly. They say that this is, in some ways, he's doing what the RSS is doing here. So it's not really very different. And, he says that the American politics is always in dynamic tension between ideological creed and actual practice. And in fact, that is quite true. And he even says that unlike Japan, where there is a much better self-perception, the US tends to be unstoppable in terms of its advancement into crisis. It keeps moving. And in that sense, as a big country and as there is a lot that China and US have in common. And I think he does see that. And this is in order to avoid that he constantly talks about some of the negative images in the US, which he saw, and which he thinks that the Chinese society needs to guard against, and this he feels can be guarded against by basically by having what he calls a culturally unified state. The party should strongly centralized. There should be faith in the party structure. And that's where he's been called an authoritarian, a neo-authoritarian. He thinks that even while he talks about the need for democracy, rights, rule of law and all that, he said they have to be firmly entrenched within the structure of the state and state security.
Jinping seems to have accepted his ideas.
Yes. And I think that is why, for example...
New development. Or was he always behind him in the past few years?
Yes. Actually, he's been in. The interesting thing about Wang Huning is that he was brought into the party by Jiang Zemin into the party, the research school. In some ways, he was like the role that they play is very much like, say, Chanbota played under Mao, or people like Hu Qiaomiu did under Mao. then
But he's writing and public speaking, etc. recently and started.
no, he's in fact much of his writings are really the older writings that are being talked about. In fact, since he joined the party, he's been not speaking at all. He's been, in fact, very carefully avoiding making public comments, except when he quotes Xi Jinping. In fact, there's a very interesting story. I don't know if you know about it. Sitaram Yechuri in 2017 asked, went, I think, at a meeting in Beijing or something, in which he asked Wang Huning whether there is any similarity between Gorbachev's idea of an interdependent and an integrated world and the Xi Jinping idea of a community of common destiny. And he said, no, there is there is no, because Xi Jinping, he's quickly, and because Yechuri said within 5 years of 4 or 5 years of Gorbachev's making that statement, the Soviet Union had collapsed. So he said, no, that is not true, because actually there is a principal difference. There is a difference in terms of, there is a major difference between what he thinks in terms of the way in which the party looks at growth and the interdependence, and he says that is highly built on the prosperity and the public good. And this is what is now being talked about. Public good on the one hand.
At some stage that we should not go the way of Soviet Union and all
yes,
that.
yes, very much so. Very much so. And that's why there is this.
Anything goes in the direction of the Gorbachev kind of reforms would eventually end in disaster.
That's exactly, they're very, and at the same time, and that's why in many ways they see this actresses effeminate culture, things like that. They see that as a kind of a attempt to weaken the spirit and resolve of the Chinese people, and to go against what the old, and that's why, in fact, Xi Jinping talks about Maoist ideas of struggle and arduous struggle, and what is that?
Would the young people revolt against this, since they are so used to this kind of entertainment?
There is actually, I think there is a certain amount of the two things he talks about was what I think he talks about lying flat. One of the things is lying flat, and the other thing is involution. Opting out of the rat race. He says that this is not that is not an option for you at this. And I think there is a very strong movement to that's where all these things come in, because there is over the years, because of the rampant development of economic growth through both private capital as well as through state capital, the difference, as you said, the Gini coefficient in China was worse than that of the US. And that has caused a certain amount of concern within the party that this can provide the basis for a major, and this is where people, for example, the Falun Gong and, the sort of cultish, moving into cults and things like that have also been things that are affecting China. And that's why they've been worried about it. And I feel that the latest sort of statements which Xi Jinping have been making is basically in terms of to sort of talk about the concern of the party and the government for a better sense of equity in the distribution, but at the same time not allowing them the people to run away with the idea that there will be a kind of welfareism, where everything will be taken care of by the state. I think that they want to avoid. And on the one hand, they'll talk about property tax and things like that, properties, etc. But at the same time, they don't want to allow the ordinary people to think that
pressurize the middle class. That is what he wants.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what I think.
That is the objective.
Yeah, that's what he's talking about, basically. And I think that to some extent that is that's the party asserting itself, and people like Wang Huning have been at the basis of it. And I said Wang Huning survived not just Jiang Zemin but Hu Jintao, and then he joined the Politburo under Xi Jinping. So there is a very strong sense where he is seen as, in fact, reflecting. He's a kind of a sense of bringing back, constantly reminding the authorities of the straight and narrow. And in that sense, I think one of our colleagues talked about him as Savonarola, like,
Yeah.
that is the Italian. But in some
there are several models to compare.
there's several models, but I think he is, in some ways, he is a kind of a traditional scholar. But at the same time, I think he is now he's now taken upon himself, I think, the responsibility to be able to remind the system that they should be.
Yes. Okay, let's turn to the external dimensions of these changes. Let's say, talk about BRI, for example. BRI has had some setbacks. People have found how bad the debt trap would be, etc. Is there any pushback on that? And with this economic changes, will the money available for BRI come down? And would there be a less emphasis on this global domination, all roads leading to Beijing? Will that policy be affected by it?
I think already during the second meeting of the BRI in 2017, there has been some rethinking, as it were, and they've thinking much more broadly in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of including local entrepreneurs and financial institutions in some of the projects that they do. Of course,
not just all freebies. Not all freebies.
No, it's not freebie. There's no freebie in any case, because
it was always long.
Chinese projects were never freebies, because I don't think even in Pakistan they were never freebies, because it just builds up. The debt builds up. But now increasingly they are talking in terms of using more than just the two Chinese banks, using international banking institutions, using even perhaps the Bretton Woods institutions if possible, and subjecting them to those kind of, they say, due diligence under those. Then they're talking increasingly
national priorities will come into play if they are using Bretton Woods.
Yes, then they're also talking in terms of using the renminbi as an international currency, and then that also in the London, for example, the London City, Corporation has actually started about 2-3 years back, or even more, when they are looking at having products built based on the renminbi as as an exchangeable currency, and therefore helping to produce in the West certain products which will help finance infrastructural projects both in Europe as well as in Africa particularly. And that is developing with some kind of, I think, obviously when this happens, there'll have to be a different kind of reporting system, a different kind of involvement, a certain greater degree of transparency. All these are precisely the problems which the BRI suffered from in the past. And in that sense,
that is the ginger.
Yes, exactly.
The story of one of our diplomats speaking about BRI and the mic being switched off. So that does it show that sensitivity that that was very stark criticism of BRI. And so the authorities clamped down and switched off her mic. It may have been a technical hitch, but it is being read as extreme sensitivity to BRI.
Yes, I think that on the one hand, there is a kind of reflection, a certain attempt to get more resilient, but that will always be, when it is done by China, it will be within the four corners of what is accepted within the party and which is they're willing to see in terms of how the impact will be. It will not be dictated from outside, and that is the whole problem that is going to be faced. Eventually, how far that will be acceptable to countries, recipient countries, is what has to be decided and discussed. And I think the problems of the BRI are not going to go away quite so much and quite so easily. And in that sense, I think the BRI, in terms of how historic it is, it's been a historic project in a sense for China's coming into the international, into the world, on the world stage. But
Feeling your own personal agenda.
absolutely. But I think the jury is still out on how successful it will be in the longer run. And I think that unless, and to some extent, other countries trying to bring alternate concepts will probably pose a challenge. But I still think that the Chinese will mount a considerable effort, because this is something which is probably their most dramatic and perhaps the biggest international project of China's coming of age, as it were, and they won't allow that to just fritter away. I think it will be eventually, and I have a feeling that somewhere down the line it will succeed in many countries in Africa particularly, and Central Asia. Though the impact, if there is any impact, will not be entirely only on the economic side, but from the political and probably the larger cultural side.
Once the recipient countries become suspicious,
Yes.
it will be affected. Anyway, we have very little time left. Let us also talk a bit about the new policy of China on India-China relations.
Oh, well,
what is like?
I think
will they become less aggressive in Ladakh, or will they become more aggressive? Will they be more confrontational with India? Will their strength of relation with Pakistan will increase? So, or will that have no effect? It will continue as it is, apart from, this, in spite of the economic changes.
I think that there is going to be a certain. I think the change in terms of the.
Is it good for us or bad for us? Simple terms.
I think we are going to see a continuation of this. It's not going to be good for us in a sense. I think we'll have to cope with the change situation, and the situation has changed in some ways irrevocably. I only hope that that at least in some respects there will be a return to some of the agreements that we've already had, particularly 2005, 1993 agreements. We talk about it. Eventually, there will have to be an element of give and take in terms of the precise delineation of the line of actual control. Yes, there will be. And I think that is inevitable. But at the same time, I think that China cannot afford to have a kind of major armed confrontation lasting for over a period of time in this part of the world, or for that matter, elsewhere.
Nor can they settle forever these issues.
Yes, that's true. That's true. The point is they cannot afford to be seen to be losing. Even however much the perception management is being done, as you've seen 2 days ago, the US ambassador designate has actually talked about China has been the aggressor in this place. And that has hurt them a great deal, because I think they had, so far it had not happened before, as it were.
He has been an India hand, I think, the ambassador.
Yes. And in that sense, I think there will be a certain amount of on both sides. I think there is an appreciation that this cannot actually get down to a full-scale conflict. But at the same time, I don't think that there's going to be a climb down from China's side, particularly after the kind of reactions that we on our part have also shown that we are not going to be inhibited by some of the larger elements in terms of the geopolitical sort of preconditions which China has been talking about, particularly vis-a-vis Indo-US relations, etc. And we've shown that we are not going to be inhibited now. We will make our choices irrespective. And while I think that deception, perhaps even deceit, is part of the Chinese toolkit, I don't think we should be doing that. We should be very clear in what we are doing. And increasingly, I have a feeling that after a long period of time, for example, China is facing major, let's say, challenges, diplomatic as well as even security challenges in the West. For a long time, the major Chinese challenges were in the East.
Will that give us a breathing time? This is what I'm trying to
No,
investigate.
I'm not sure that this. The fact is, we have to live by. I think the way in which we have reacted is probably the right reaction. That is, we know that this is going to stay with us, but at the same time, we look for alternate avenues through building up linkages across the world with a whole series of states, and at the same time, not really making too much of a not, for example, I think Jayashankar's in his what's it, three accommodations and eight principles, etc. Those are, I think, very important. I think it's important that we don't get in a sense bamboozled into an open conflict, but at the same time make clear that we will keep where we are. I think that's a very important.
Also, we are not pushed too hard into the American
Yes,
hands.
yeah, I know that I think there are reasons even apart from the China angle, where we will need to, and I think there is. I don't know. In a sense, I feel that we've moved irrevocably away from Deng Xiaoping's statement to Rajiv Gandhi that there can't be a Asian century, 21st century can't be an Asian century unless both India and China are able to develop.
What Pandit Nehru said many years ago.
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, now China seems to think that there can be only one star or a sun in the Asian sort of sky firmament.
Okay, finally, Vijay, about U.S.-China relations.
Ah.
President Biden seems to have said in the middle of all this that capitalism without competition is not capitalism; it is exploitation, etc. Is he in a way supporting the move away from capitalism in a sense? Is that what he intended? You saw that statement, didn't you?
Yes, but I think he is trying, in a sense, he's trying to bring the US ideological sort of position juxtapose it to what is the Chinese talk in terms of
That's what I'm saying. So I see that kind of linkage.
prosperity. And in some ways, he is saying that we are not very different, though we talk about ourselves as, the US is the citadel of capitalism, and the Chinese seem to call themselves now the citadel of state capitalism, or at least they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, but it's clearly more state capitalism. But both of them
moving away from competition in capitalism. So President Biden was saying you need competition in it.
Yes, yeah. I think that's the Chinese. For them, I think they also do see the need for a balance between the state ownership and private capital. I don't think they're moving away to a completely state ownership driven system. So in that sense, they also necessarily accept the need for competition, because I think competition is what, particularly amongst the regions, amongst the regional competition has always been the case there. Between state and locality, there's been competition between in terms of projects, and between private sector and the public sector. If there was, in fact, the problem with many of the state organizations in China is no different from state-owned enterprises in other parts of the world, including in India, because of their.
We went through a change in the 90s, and people accepted it.
Yes.
Because there was prosperity, there was greater strength for the nation, etc. So similarly now, this reverse process that the Chinese are adopting would be also acceptable to their people. That's what you think?
I think that has to be, it is acceptable to the people because it is accompanied by what they call the common prosperity thing. So at a public level, there is going to be acceptance, and the party has the control to be able to make it applicable to some of the more powerful business groups. And I think they have to make an example of some groups like Evergrande, like even Alibaba, in order to be able to send the message across And I think
Some people may
the
think
fact that
the race
Alibaba
to
is
the
back
top.
in public is itself an indication that he's accepted it.
Some people may feel that the race to the top is being slowed down, and that may cause some pushback to these policies at some stage. We
No,
don't
I
know
think
that.
the Chinese know that the race for the race, the pace, in a sense, is any case going to fall. The Chinese realize that they are already now. Of course, they think that the apogee will come perhaps in the next few years. But I think that they've already begun to see that the pace of growth, the bristling kind of rate of growth, is never going to be repeated now. There's no way in which it can be repeated.
So they are adjusting themselves to the new
Absolutely,
situation.
and doing it in a manner where they are probably taking a little more pain than they would otherwise have in order to be able to ensure that there is a larger social purpose, a social justice, which is going to be. And I think from that point of view, while they do, I think that the United States has been talking of competition, where we, what is it? This is competing, cooperating where we must, cooperating where we can, competing where we must, and taking on and confronting
That's the
when we just
Biden. That's
have
the
to.
Biden.
Yes. So that, I think these people realize that is not going to change. There has been a realization. I think China has realized that the US now does see that there is a kind of a change in the old Clintonian and other sort of approaches that in the West that thought that the Chinese system will change as a result of their prosperity. That is completely, and now they do see that the United States perceives in China a global competitor, possibly even in the realm of technology, and I think that the Chinese have realized that this will result in a whole regime of denials of technology, which is going to affect its growth. And I think that is something which they're increasingly attempting to cope with. So just as China, which is almost five times now as big as India he expects India to cope with this thing. They have to do the same thing with the country, which is probably five times their size in terms of per capita. Not so much. I mean, in terms of purchasing power parity, perhaps GDP, China has already surpassed the United States.
Well, thank you very much, Vijay. We are running out of time. Otherwise, we would have talked also about environment.
Not at all. Sorry, I'm sort of. This is.
President Xi not going to Glasgow, Prime Minister of India. So anyway, we have the time for that maybe.
India has a major proposal, a major initiative that it has to actually showcase over there in Glasgow, isn't it?
Will we accept this net carbon-free year? India is one of the countries which have not.
China is going to be net carbon-free by 2060. That's
2060 is what they have announced, right?
No, they've announced 2060. So that they will do it by 2060. I think that is fine. India can't do it by that stage, and I think we can't afford to have just one-sided emphasis only on mitigation targets. But I think increasingly we will have to make some kind of an effort to reach a carbon-free kind of a situation.
For that, we need investment and technology.
Yes. That's
what John Kerry keeps hinting at it, but there is no idea what is it. And knowing John Kerry very well, we can imagine what he will do.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Vijay, for this very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure viewers will also benefit from it.
Thank you.
Extremely grateful to you for sharing this time. Thank you very much.
Bye.
All the best.